Mahendra Pallava produces one story about a bar where a courtesan, a prostitute, is at the bar and with a Buddhist monk, and the Buddhist monk has got a skull which he's drinking spirits out of, and the skull goes missing.
The spread of Hinduism, especially towards East, what started this cultural dominance?
So what happens is that initially Indian trade is focused with Rome.
The historians, few of them, they have very strong objection on your style of history writing. All the Romila Thapas and Irfan Habibs of this world.
I'm not sure that's true. If you write about the Mughals, you are glorifying the Mughals and somehow you're a Marxist associated with the Congress Party, Aligarh. While if you're interested in ancient India, you are a RSS Prachatnik with khaki shorts. So when you read about Elon Musk and the algorithms of Facebook or Twitter or all this stuff today, this goes back to this period, and it's Indian ideas being translated into Arabic.
William, my next question is, how do we differentiate stories from the stories and historical sources? किताबवाला के एक और एपिसोड में आपका भरपूर स्वागत है। जितनी हिंदी है वो शुरुआत में ही है, क्योंकि जो भाई साहब हैं वो अंग्रेज़ी में लिखते हैं और क्या कमाल लिखते हैं हिंदुस्तान के इतिहास के बारे में। नई किताब है द गोल्डन रोड, इसे लिखा है विलियम डेलरिम्पल ने। विलियम डेलरिम्पल इससे पहले सिटी ऑफ जिन, एज ऑफ कली, वाइट मुगल और द लास्ट मुगल, ज़ेनाडू, इस तरह कई किताबें लिख चुके हैं, रिटर्न ऑफ द किंग एज वेल। और ज़्यादातर इनका जो काम रहा है वो हिंदुस्तानी उपमहाद्वीप के इर्द गिर्द रहा है, जिसमें मेडिवल एज पे ज़्यादा काम रहा, लेकिन मार्को पोलो पे भी इनका काम रहा है और एंग्लो अफ़गान वॉर पे भी बहुत विस्तार से बात हुई है। इसके अलावा इनके अपने यात्रा वृत्तांत भी रहे हैं। लेकिन ये जो किताब है ये एंशिएंट इंडिया जिसको कहते हैं, प्राचीन भारत कहते हैं, और जिसे गोल्डन एज भी कहा जाता है, जिसमें मौर्यन एम्पायर है। हम सम्राट अशोक को जानते हैं, उनके राज चिन्ह हमारे सरकारी प्रतीक चिन्हों का, हमारे राष्ट्रीय प्रतीक चिन्हों का हिस्सा हैं। गुप्त काल, जो साइंस की दृष्टि से भारत का बहुत गोल्डन एज रहा है। आर्यभट्ट और ब्रह्मगुप्त और वराहमिहिर जैसे बड़े विद्वान यहाँ पर रहे हैं। इसके अलावा अगर हम दक्षिण भारत की दृष्टि से देखें तो पल्लव डायनेस्टी, पल्लव राजवंश और चोल राजवंश, जिनकी तूती ऑस्ट्रेलिया के ठीक पहले तक बोलती थी। जावा, सुमात्रा, बाली, कंबोडिया, वियतनाम, इन इलाकों में इनका असर, इनका रसूख, इनके नेवल फ्लीट की, इनके ट्रेडर्स की धमक रही है। और साउथ चाइना सी तक आपको चिन्ह मिलेंगे। और इन सब के बीच एक यात्री हैं जो हिंदुस्तान आते हैं हर्षवर्धन के समय में नालंदा में अध्ययन करने के लिए, उनका नाम वेनसांग है। और वो जब वापस जाते हैं तब वहाँ पे तांग राजवंश का शासन चल रहा होता है और एक महारानी है जो सत्ता के शीर्ष पर पहुँचना चाहती हैं, वू जिनतान उनका नाम है। उनके साथ कैसे वेनसांग कोलैबोरेट करते हैं और फिर कैसे बौद्ध धर्म वहाँ राजकीय प्रश्रय वाला धर्म बन जाता है। और विलियम डेलरिम्पल तमाम उदाहरणों के साथ ये बात स्थापित करते हैं कि हिंदुस्तान और चीन रिलीजियस पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से, कल्चरल और ट्रेड के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से इतने करीब कभी नहीं आए। इसके अलावा इस्लाम के उदय के बाद किस तरह से एक राजा है जो संधि का प्रस्ताव भेजता है 8वीं सदी में, और एक चीज़ है जो बगदाद का मुख्य वज़ीर ख़ास तौर पर मंगवाता है। और ये कोई आभूषण नहीं है, ये कोई मसाले नहीं हैं जिनके ज़रिए हिंदुस्तान ने व्यापार में ग्रीको रोमन एम्पायर पर या उसके अगल बगल के एम्पायर्स पर सदियों तक शासन किया है। ये किताब की मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट है, किताब जो ब्रह्मगुप्त ने लिखी है, जिसमें गणित के कई जटिल फॉर्मूले हैं जो संस्कृत में हैं। तो ये किताब मंगवाई जाती है साथ में एक ऐसे ब्राह्मण को जो इस किताब के संस्कृत को अरबी लोगों को समझा सके। रेस्ट इज़ हिस्ट्री, किस तरह से फिर मैथ्स और मॉडर्न अलजेब्रा बगदाद के उस राजवंश से इटली तक पहुंचती है और उसके बाद कैसे वो रेनेसा का, व्यापार से रेनेसा से इंडस्ट्रियल रिवोल्यूशन का और कॉलोनी के एक्सपेंशन का आधार बनता है। ये एक लंबी कहानी है। गोल्डन रोड जो शब्द है ये इस्तेमाल किया गया है दो बड़े व्यापारिक सामुद्रिक रास्तों के लिए, समंदर के ज़रिए। एक रास्ता है जो आप मान के चलें कि सिंध के इलाके से लेके और केरल के इलाके तक के जो पोर्ट हैं, बंदरगाह हैं, जहाँ से बड़ी मात्रा में हिंदुस्तानी मसाले, हिंदुस्तानी रत्न वगैरह जाते थे और जो ये मेडिटेरेनियन सी से होते हुए अपना कारोबार किया करते थे, जिसकी वजह से प्राचीन भारत की समृद्धि रही। और मध्यकाल तक आते आते जब उनके झगड़े बहुत बढ़ गए बेजेंटाइन एम्पायर और पर्शियन एम्पायर के साथ, और वो रूट कुछ ब्लॉक हो गया, वहाँ उतना कारोबार नहीं रहा, तब हम ईस्ट की तरफ मुड़े इसी गोल्डन रूट में, और हमने चीन से लेके और बाली, जावा, सुमात्रा, कंबोडिया, वियतनाम तक विस्तार किया। तो इसकी कहानी है गोल्डन रोड। और इसके ज़रिए विलियम डैलिम्पल ये प्रपोज कर रहे हैं कि जिस सिल्क रूट की बार बार बात होती है वो बहुत ही नया जिक्र है। दरअसल एंशिएंट इंडिया में सिल्क रूट जैसा कुछ था नहीं जिसके ज़रिए चीन अपने विश्व आधिपत्य की बात करता है। ये गोल्डन रूट था, ये गोल्डन रोड थी जो पानी के रास्ते थी, जिसके ज़रिए इंडिया वॉज एट द टॉप ऑफ global trade. Mr. Dalrymple, welcome to Kitabwala, and we are
There's
very
much more to
excited.
add after that brilliant description, Saurabh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for writing this wonderful, beautiful book with so many examples and your trademark style where there are so many stories. We'll go one by one, chapter by chapter, and then in the end, we'll come to your other body of work, like your very popular podcast, The Empire. We'll talk about that.
Lovely.
And then there are a couple of critics who have raised few observations and questions.
Happy to
about
answer
your-
any questions, Saurabh.
Thank you so much. First question. You were primarily writing about medieval India and medieval world. What prompted you to write this book?
Well, I was really writing about early colonial India. I've written 4 books, which is the story of how the East India Company took over India. In your schooling and my schooling, we were taught that the British took over India after the Mughals collapsed and after the Marathas were defeated. But it's actually more sinister than that. It's the story of a trading company, like a massive multinational business. The equivalent today would be Apple or Elon Musk's X or one of these enormous American corporations. And it's such an extraordinary story. I told it in 4 parts. It starts with the anarchy, then it goes on to White Mughals, then Return of a King, which is the story of the folly of the East India Company invading Afghanistan, and then finally the story of 1857, a story you know very well from your own work, Saurabh, and the story of Bahadur Shah Zafar. And I worked closely on all 4 of those books with a wonderful scholar called Bruce Wannell. And Bruce was a brilliant scholar of 18th century Persian and could read Mughal manuscripts with the ease with which you or I could read India today. He just was able to, even with difficult scribal shorthands, just read it fluently. And he died of pancreatic cancer in just after the publication of the Anarchy.
So sorry to hear that.
Real loss. I miss him a lot, and miss him both personally and professionally. And so there was anyway the book. This quartet was finished, and I decided rather than doing something close to that, to do something completely different, and to look at my first love, in fact, which was ancient history. And when I was a kid, I used to go on archaeological digs. When I first came to India, the things I looked at first were Ajanta, Ellora, Sanchi, and I think my teenage self would be very surprised that I ended up writing about the 18th and 19th centuries, because my interest as a kid was always ancient Rome, ancient Persia, ancient Middle East, and ancient India. And so I've had a wonderful time. I mean, this is not a book of Indian history. It's a book of how Indian ideas left India and went abroad. So I was able to travel to wonderful places like Cambodia, Angkor Wat, to Java, to Borobudur, through China, through parts of Sicily, and all over the world, looking at how Indian ideas changed the world around them.
Yeah, so for the research work, did you go to Egypt or Ethiopia as well?
I went to Egypt and had an amazing time there on the Red Sea coast, and Alexandria. No, so I had some wonderful travels, and Also, this was very much a lockdown book. I did all the reading for this when we were all locked up in 2019, 2020. And it allowed that time, which was very frustrating in many ways, was also a wonderful time to read and write. Because there were so few distractions. Normally you have literary festivals, parties, invitations here and there to lecture. In COVID, there was nothing to do but read, and it allowed me to dive really deeply into this period of history, which I'd always been interested in, but was not a specialist in before. And it was 5 years' work, but I've never been so excited with any subject. It was wonderful to rediscover this period I'd always loved. And also just to travel immediately after COVID, when no one else was traveling. I was more or less on the first plane into Angkor Wat, which normally is besieged by hundreds of thousands of tourists, particularly from China, because it's very close to China. Yeah. I saw Angkor in a way that I'll never see it again, almost empty. And the same with Borobudur. Borobudur was actually still closed, and I managed to get a connection at the Ministry of Culture and got into the largest Buddhist monument in the world with the director of the site alone for 3 days, and to really go from sculpture to sculpture with this wonderful scholar and really get to know the site intimately. So very exciting to research, and I think the excitement shows in the writing. It was sometimes books come slowly. This book came in a great blaze. The actual writing took about 9 months, and it just came pouring out in the great torrent.
I love the chapterization as well. The fifth concubine, A Gale of Stillness. Is it your handwork or the editor's?
No, I choose my own titles. And with some books, I've employed help with archives and translations. Because it was a lockdown book, this book was actually, I didn't have any assistance of any sort at any point. This was entirely me on my own sitting here. And again, that was very nice, just this feeling of discovering this whole new period in a deep dive over 5 years. It was very exciting.
When I was reading this book, I was thinking from the diplomatic and the strategic point of view that one of the unifying factor, one of the edge India has, that Buddhism started here and is spread to Japan, Korea, China, all the ASEAN countries. And we can really capitalize it while forming new global bonds. When I was reading the first chapter, the first thought which struck was, history is so accidental at times.
It's true.
John Smith leading a hunting party. Yeah. And there we are, Ajanta and Ellora.
Yeah, it's true. Not Ellora, but Ajanta.
Ajanta, sorry, yeah.
So, yes, and even the spread of Buddhism had a lot of accident behind it. For 200 or 300 years, it hardly spread outside the area of Bihar, Lumbini, Sarnath, Bodh Gaya. Mm-hmm. And the accident that it was the Emperor Ashoka who really turbocharged Buddhism, sent his Dharma ministers, his missionaries out. And I think it's Ashoka that was responsible for this extraordinary spread of Buddhism. Within 200 or 300 years, it's not just the ASEAN countries, but Siberia, Mongolia, Philippines. It traveled, and Egypt. It traveled in both directions so far, and had a major influence. I mean, it
reminded me of that island temple of a deity who was later declared the mother of Buddha as well. It's close to Red Sea. You mentioned
Socotra?
Yes.
Yeah. So Socotra is an amazing site. It's on the mouth of the Red Sea, and among the other sites there is a cave where Indian sailors stopped on their way to Egypt because it had fresh water.
Yes.
And someone has just done a PhD and published this research. He's found something like 1,000 pieces of ancient Indian graffiti, mainly by Gujus, who all wrote their name, Mahanavikas, and
while passing through.
And some of them, a lot of them are Hindu, a lot of them are Buddhist, some Christians, some Jains. And so much work has been done on this subject over the last 40, 50 years. I mean, there hasn't really been a book like this pulling all these different subjects together, pulling the story of the spread of Buddhism, the spread of Hinduism, the spread of science. I think since A.L. Basham's Wonder That Was India in 1954, and since then, the field has completely transformed. There's been lots of archaeology, there's been lots of new discoveries, and it's very exciting getting all these new finds into it. But the most exciting and important find, I think, in the first half of the book, is the idea that India and Rome were each other's most important trading partners. Mm-hmm. We're very familiar today with the idea of the Silk Road. And at this moment in London, there are 2 big Silk Road exhibitions. Everyone has this idea of, Marco Polo on his camel crossing the Pamirs and so on. But actually, in the early period, in the classical period, at the time of Ashoka and the period immediately after Ashoka, during the Gupta era, it was India that was the main center of East-West commerce, not China. The Romans and the Chinese were never in direct contact. There was never an embassy going between the two. There was never a single trader that we know of that passed from one to the other. But there were huge fleets of boats leaving the Red Sea coast of Egypt and using the winds of the monsoon to come to India, particularly to Kerala, but also to Gujarat and the mouth of the Ganges, to a place called Babarakam, which is quite close to where modern Karachi is. Yeah. Baruch is Barigaza, the ancient Barigaza. Babarakam is the name of essentially Karachi, if you like. It's the city at the mouth of the of the Indus. And these 3 ports were hugely important to the trade between Rome and India. And the big thing that facilitated this was the monsoon winds. India has a unique gift, which is that its winds travel for 6 months in one direction and 6 months back again. No other country has this. And it's because of Tibet, the freezing of the Tibetan plateau, cold winds blow in winter, then in the summer it thaws and the warm winds blow out. And this creates these monsoon winds twice a year. But it means that an Indian can just put up a sail, and once they've learnt to ride the monsoon, like learning to surf or something, you can go in just 2-3 months to Egypt, or to the Malacca Straits in China, and then the winds reverse and you can come back again 6 months later.
And if you miss the monsoon, then you're stuck for
another year. Exactly. But this is why you have, from very early on, these large trading communities of Indians in East Africa, in the Gulf, on one side, and on the other side you've got all the Chettiars all over what's now Burma and Malaysia and Cambodia and Vietnam. And this is because of the winds. And this is what allowed first the traders, then the missionaries, then the intellectuals to come and bring first their trading goods, then their ideas. And I think India has underplayed its role as a transformative force to the world around it. We know how Greek ideas transformed the world because the colonial powers told that story. We now know how the Chinese transformed everything with the Silk Road, because this is an idea which has been propagated by the Chinese state. Xi Jinping has turned it into the Belt and Road. But I don't believe that the Silk Road existed in the ancient period. It was a medieval idea. And before then, India was important. But India is not being good at telling the story. We don't know about the influence.
We need to do more. Publicity.
Exactly. And I think it's a surprise even to many Indians when they go for the first time to Cambodia and they find these stories of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana all over Angkor Wat. When they go to Japan and find not just Buddhism but images of Ganesha and Hanuman and so on in Buddhist temples in Korea and Japan.
Or when we find Shiv temple in Guangzhou, China.
Or when we find a Shiv temple from the Cholas in Guangzhou. And so this is part of a huge movement of Indian trade, Indian ideas, Indian missionaries, Indian sculptors, Indian dancers.
And Indian science.
And Indian science.
Top it all.
Indian science, top it all. And again, in the West, everyone knows about Greek mathematicians like Pythagoras or Archimedes. Name Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, who you both talked about in your introduction. Yeah. No one's heard their name in the West. Now, why is this? Why is it that we know Pythagoras but don't know Brahmagupta? It shouldn't be, in the 21st century, that should not be the case, because Brahmagupta defining zero, Aryabhatta finding the circumference of the earth, his achievement is every bit as great as Pythagoras or Archimedes with his Eureka and his bath. Now, when I grew up, I knew about Archimedes from the age of 7, but it was only in my 30s probably when I came here that I first heard about Aryabhatta. So I think there's a lot of stuff which India has not been good at telling. And this book tries to bring together the work of Indian scholars working in lots of different fields, on the spread of Buddhism, on the spread of Sanskrit, on the spread of Hinduism, on the spread of Indian science, and tries to bring the whole thing together into a single narrative.
When we start reading about the ancient India, the first mention is the raid of Alexander, how he defeated a couple of kings, including the great king of Punjab called Porus or Puru, and then that very popular anecdote, how should I treat you, the way one king treats other. And then we talk about the rise of Mauryan Empire, especially the Chandragupta. I was a little surprised when I read in your book that there is a possibility that Chandragupta was part of Alexander's army. As per the Jain.
This is the Jain view. It's later, so it's not certain, but that was the Jain tradition, yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And
because he was studying in Taxila, and he had been kicked out of his kingdom at that point in the story, according to the Jain.
So he was like a political refugee.
So he was like a refugee, and according to the Jain sources, he was a great hero worshipper of Alexander, and he asked to join in the army.
And later he abdicated and became a Jain monk.
And finally he became a Jain monk and died in Savannah-Belagola, according to the Jain sources. Yeah, exactly.
While going through all these ancient scriptures, what did you find the principal reason that Buddhism, it expanded largely because of the trader community and not the Jainism? Because in the current India, we see more trader community attached with Jainism rather than Buddhism.
It's a really good question. There are a couple of Jain inscriptions in Vietnam, but in general, it didn't travel. Hinduism traveled, Buddhism traveled, but Jainism, and I don't know the answer to it, and I was looking for it wherever I went, because it always intrigued me why, if Hinduism and Buddhism, and if Buddhism is part of the trading world like the Jains are, but even Hinduism, which from the time of the laws of Manu have these ideas about not passing the black.
You cannot cross the sea.
People got around that, and they did cross the sea, as Indians always have done. But it is there in the laws of Manu, and it's there also in some of the Puranas. And so you would imagine the Jains would have travelled and would have spread their religion, but there's precious little evidence of it. There's some in Vietnam, and I think one inscription in Cambodia maybe, but it's very limited. And it's a mystery. I don't know the answer.
And what do you think, what were the traits of Buddhism which really appeal? Because in the book you have given all the details that how Buddhism also changed over the time, and especially during the Kushana period, how it was given face and statues and all those things. So there's a great transformation of Buddhism as well, because in the earlier paintings there's only a face or a tree or an empty throne.
2 feet. Yes, Buddhism transformed itself, as all religions do. Religions evolve, they don't remain static.
But we cannot imagine Buddhist monk running a copper mine in Afghanistan.
And since I published the book, I went to see some of the early sites in Malaysia, and one of the first Buddhist, possibly the first Buddhist monastery in Malaysia, at the site of Bujang, near modern Penang, is on an iron ore site. The largest iron ore deposit in Southeast Asia. So we have this idea of the Buddhists being very otherworldly and ascetic, but actually they were very much connected to the trading communities, and they had a very good financial sense, just like the Christian monks did in Europe. The Christian monks in Europe famously dominated the wool trade.
Yes.
In early Indian history, you find that the early monasteries were banks. They lent at interest to the merchants. And if you go to early Buddhist sites, you find that there's what we would call crowdfunding. That one of the early gateways at Sanchi says this was donated by the ivory carvers of Vidisha. If you go to the Buddhist site at Karla outside Pune, it says the merchants of Sopara paid for this, for the excavation of this cave. And so you get the merchant communities aligning with the Buddhist monasteries. And particularly when you go up into the Hindu Kush and up into the Pamirs, the monks there seem to have provided shelter and a safe place to stay for the monks crossing the Himalayas. And in return, they lent money and they were given donations. And we have some very detailed inscriptional evidence showing the relationship between traders and particularly sailors. In Andhra Pradesh, for example, on the coast near modern Guntur, there is an inscription talking about how the monks had lent a Mahanavika, a great sailor, a great sea captain, money to trade in what is now Thailand, Dvaravarti at the time. And that he came back and he donated the sculptures for a stupa on his return. So we have evidence of this very close relationship between the monks and the traders. One is lending money and providing shelter. The other is, if you like, sort of karma washing. After they've made a fortune, they donate to the monastery, and in return they earn good karma.
And I witnessed the adaptability of this religion as well, where they incorporated all the local deities, Yaksh and Yakshinis and other
Nags and Naginis. Nagarajas.
And then they started giving provision as well that if you can donate this.
Correct.
And then the cycle will accelerate. And they specifically identified the needs of merchants. So all those Bodhisattva stories and Jatak stories where if there's a sea storm and this, you can chant this and it will save this, and all those flying.
And these are very good sources for discovering the history of the diffusion of Indian ideas, because a lot of the stories of saints contain really important early historical information. So we know through Xuanzang, who used to be pronounced in Hindi, Xuanzang. Yeah, obviously.
So the right pronunciation is Xuanzang.
The Chinese say Xuanzang.
Xuanzang, okay.
And his account and then his biographer's account is one of the most important.
Hui, what's the name of the biographer? H-U-I.
Huli.
Yeah.
And then we have later monks like Yi Jing, and we often learn about how they traveled. For example, Yi Jing uses Persian sailors. The Persian sailors from Persia.
He doesn't take the land route.
He doesn't take. He takes the sea route via Sumatra, because by the time he comes along, there's a major Buddhist presence in Indonesia.
And he keeps saying that you don't need to go to India to learn
Sanskrit. You don't need to go all the way to Nalanda. You can learn very good Sanskrit in Java, he says, or Sumatra.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Xuanzang. Now we are talking about him. What up?
Amazing man. Amazing story.
Adventurous story. I mean.
So he's a kind of scholarly nerd. He would have been a JNU PhD or something today. And he gets really upset that he thinks the texts he's using are corrupt, that they've been badly translated and they're no longer the authentic words of the Buddha. Mm-hmm. And he determines to risk his life and go and find the original texts back in India, and specifically in Nalanda, the great
He was about to be
Mahavihara.
killed.
Several times he's about to be killed. Robbers and all sorts of people get dakus. And anyway, he makes it to Nalanda and he spends 20 years copying out manuscripts. Nalanda at that point being like the Oxford or the Cambridge.
And he meets the great teacher.
And he goes at the feet of Silabhadra, who's the great man for the Yogacara texts that he wants to read. And so we have, with ancient history, it's very frustrating because often there are important periods of history which are completely dark. We have no sources at all. And then suddenly it's like someone turns the lights on. And Xuanzang is one of those moments. We have his account and we have his biographer, who you mentioned, Hu Li. And these two together provide an incredibly detailed account of India under the rule of Harsha, of Nalanda, when it was the most important university in Asia, the main center of learning where you could learn not just Buddhist texts, but the Vedas, logic, grammar, mathematics, a whole variety of different sciences. And it was like what the Library of Alexandria was to the Roman world, Nalanda was to the Indic world. There were 9 stories to the library in Nalanda. And
three
the 3 sections,
9
exactly. And any monk was allowed to borrow the text, but they had to put the manuscript into a pigeonhole in the central courtyard every night. That's the rule. Amazing. Yeah.
We'll come back to Xuanzang's story, but you were saying that there are dark phases, like we hardly have any details of Mihir and why he was so anti-Buddhism. We hardly have any details of...
it is actually Xuanzang that is the main source for this story.
but he wrote it in the 7th, 8th century. I mean.
A century later. Yeah, correct.
So he was largely relying on what he heard or what he saw.
There are those who say that Mihir was actually generous to the Buddhists and that Xuanzang a century later got it wrong. It's a disputed bit of history. And this is often the way with ancient history. You have one source saying one thing, and then another source from another area saying something different. So it's quite different. I mean, the history I've been writing up to now of the 18th century, you have so many sources, you can generally have a pretty clear idea of what happened in any given time. Ancient history is not like that. You're in the dark, and a single archaeological discovery can completely change. To give you an example, at the Chola time, we've always believed that the Cholas conquered quite a lot of Southeast Asia. There's this inscription in the Tanjore big temple saying this. There's now reason to believe, some scholars think, that in actual fact, Raja Chola was exaggerating his achievements, and the real work was being done by the merchant guilds. And that the merchant guilds were controlling all this Southeast Asian stuff. That they were
more invested.
They were providing the boats, and so this is going to be a subject which is under dispute.
So what will happen to all those great inscriptions on the temple wall? That how he went there with the heavy naval fleet and crushed them all.
You've got to think always when you're examining, particularly ancient sources, who's it addressed to, who's reading this, and what's the point? And like today, you know, any government, not just our government in India, but any government in the US or in Britain, they'll give out their version of events, with, their spin. And so when you read an official inscription on a temple, you've got to remember that it could be true. But equally, it's the ruler giving his version and probably exaggerating his achievements like all rulers do.
We have very little details of Kanishka period. In fact, we have somewhat details of Kanishka period, but overall the Kushan period, and very little details of Gupta dynasty, barring the Udaygiri cave and stuff. Do you think there are few new discoveries which are shedding new light on it?
There are lots of new discoveries, and particularly with both the Guptas and the Kushans, people are studying very carefully the coins, the numismatics. And there are extraordinary insights to be gained by looking at the coins and studying the dates and so on. And every year more is being discovered. What's interesting about the Kushans is that while they came in and conquered India from what's now Kashgar and Xinjiang in western China, by coming down as far as Mathura, south of Delhi, north of Agra, they, in a sense, opened up the Himalayas because it was now under both sides of the Himalayas was under one kingdom. And it allowed Buddhist monks to come through those passes in the Himalayas and to bring Buddhism and Indian ideas and Sanskrit literature to Western China and then to China proper. So, for example, the oldest surviving manuscript of the Mahabharata that we have was found not in India, but was found near Kashgar. Partly because the deserts there are so good at preserving, there's no moisture, so texts and early palm leaves and things survive. But what you see after the 4th and 5th century is China becomes a very important center of Buddhism. And there's been Buddhism in China since the 1st and 2nd century, but by the 4th and 5th century, it's dominant at court alongside Confucianism and Taoism. And then when Xuanzang comes back from Nalanda, he allies with an extraordinary woman called Wu Zetian.
Wu Zetian.
And she's a crucial figure. I don't think she's well known at all in India, although she's well known in China today because there's a very sort of sexy soap opera about her. She was a great beauty, and it's like 250
Is it
parts.
largely relying on the Confucius viewpoint?
No, it is. It's very critical
Because then
of her.
they must have portrayed her as a villain.
She's this sort of temptress figure. She's like the kind of ultimate
She
killer
killed
queen.
everybody and who'd the king and then king's son.
But ironically, this woman who is said to be such a killer is the woman that brings Buddhism as the court religion. And because Confucianism doesn't allow women to rule, but Buddhism does, she opts for turning China into a Buddhist land. And it's Wu Zetian, the only woman ruler of China in 3,000 years of Chinese dynastic history. She's the one that converts China to being, briefly, the state religion is Buddhism. And it's at this period that you find Nalanda monks and Nalanda-trained Chinese monks running the levers of power in China. And there's what we today I think would call probably a think tank, like you have in Delhi and in Washington, these groups of scholars producing policy. In her case, this is a bunch of Nalanda-trained monks from India who've come to live in Chang'an, the Chinese
name
capital.
as well, the Scholars of North
Scholars
Gate.
of the Northern Gate,
Northern
exactly
Gate,
that.
yeah.
You read very carefully, Saurabh. I'm very impressed. You've got a good memory. Yeah, so these guys are like, in Britain we had this various think tanks that came up with the idea of Brexit and pushed it through, and that was a very bad idea.
Horrible idea, I'm sorry.
But I agree, I'm totally with you. But these guys hatched these ideas and then they make it into Parliament. Exactly the same as with Wu Zetian. She brings these scholars together, and so you have these. Suddenly, it's the high point of Indian influence in Chinese history. Never again will alumni of an Indian university be close to the levers of power in China. Today, India, powerful as it is today, India does not have much influence on China. There's no one in Beijing bringing Indian ideas to fruition. But at the time of Wu Zetian, you have an entire body of Nalanda-trained monks who are the court astronomer, who are the court intellectuals and driving policy. And they work with Wu Zetian, and Wu Zetian uses them because they allow a woman to rule. And they come up with all these prophecies.
She needs to replace the popular theory,
exactly.
the Confucius theory, which belittles the women in the court, or in general in society.
And she also uses the Buddhist monks, and they produce these prophecies that she is a reincarnation of Maitreya, she's this, she's that. So everyone is winning. There's a relationship, and they produce these slightly bogus
They almost declare
prophecies.
that she is the future Buddha, the Maitreya.
Exactly that. They do say that she is Maitreya. Not almost. They actually do. Yeah.
We are talking about a lot of connections, and I was very surprised when I read that in the Isis temple they found a trinity of early Hindu prototype. So I was interested and intrigued as well that which is this prototype, and then you said that Balaram, Vasudev and Eka Namasha.
So it's like a sort of early version of the Krishna,
the Puranic gods.
Well, before that, really.
Yeah.
It's what will become Vaishnavism. It will evolve into Vaishnavism and the cult of Krishna. And we have these gods also appearing, for example, very early in Afghanistan. There are coins with Vasudev coming from the site of Aikanum, which is right up on the Oxus. In northern Afghanistan. So
this was the time of Kushans?
This is the time of the Bactrian Greeks and early Kushans, correct. And in the same Isis temple in Egypt, there's also a beautiful face of the Buddha.
Yes.
carved in a Gandharan style, as if in Afghan or Pakistan
White
style.
marble.
But white marble. It's beautiful, utterly beautiful. Just found 3 years ago. This is a brand new find, and it shows that how many Hindu and Buddhist Indian sailors were sailing with the monsoon over the oceans and arriving on the Red Sea coast. And it raises all sorts of questions. We have an account by the Roman geographer Strabo saying that he went to one of the harbors on the Red Sea coast and saw 250 vessels waiting to sail to India because they had to wait for the monsoon winds to turn. But so what we've got to imagine is not one or two traders going bravely into the unknown, but fleets, massive fleets of traders going backwards and forwards. And the reason they were doing this is that your Indian ancestors were ripping off my European ancestors, overcharging for ivory, for cotton, for silk.
Black pepper.
And black pepper most of all. Exactly, all these things.
I'm really surprised. Why black pepper? I mean, why were they so fascinated? Because one of the historian was saying bad things that why are they so obsessed?
So Pliny, there's always
Pliny
concern.
hated the idea of black pepper in any of the dishes.
And he didn't like silk either. He thought silk was an immoral textile that allowed you to see the shape of a woman as if she was naked when she was fully dressed. So he's down on black pepper. He says, why do the young today spend money on this pungent black powder? What's wrong with olive oil? So it's really interesting. So India was providing really expensive luxuries to the Romans. And Roman gold was pouring from Europe with the monsoon winds down to Gujarat, to Kerala, to all the west coast ports of India. And the most important evidence we have that India, not China, was the principal trading partner is if you map the coin hoards.
You have given a map as well in the book.
I've given the map. And there's no coins going across to China. There's not a single Roman coin ever found in China. What there are, though, are hundreds of thousands of gold Roman coins found all over the coast of Kerala and Tamil Nadu.
Reminding me of that vessel they dug deep in Kerala.
With I think, 250 Roman aurii, the gold coins, in just one pot near Kottayam on the coast of Kerala.
That's why you've written that only because of the custom tax, Romans were getting around 1/3 of their revenue.
So Pliny complains that all this Roman gold is pouring into India. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask, why did the Romans allow it? Because they were, in a sense, impoverishing themselves. They were getting these luxuries like pepper and silk, which are, frankly, ephemeral. They're not essential things. Mm-hmm. You don't need pepper. You don't need ivory. You don't need cotton. And the reason is that they had a 30% customs tax on the Red Sea coast. And the amount of money made by the Roman state, it was like an income tax, because these were not essentials, these were luxury products.
Yes.
And so it was going for the rich. And by charging 30%, according to scholars now, they're thinking that between a quarter and a third of the entire Roman military budget was provided by the customs take on the Red Sea coast. Amazing.
William, my next question is, how do we differentiate stories from the stories and historical sources? Like there's a story of Menander, whom we call Milind as well, right?
Correct.
So there's a story about his conversation with Nagasena. So in the
correct.
So one interpretation is that Nagasena asked him that please provide me this. So some food, some clothes. But in the later scripts, it's like because of Nagasena's influence, Milid converted and became a Buddhist like Ashoka. And you have given that caution as well. So how do we differentiate that? How to read this story?
So when you're a historian, you're in the position like being in a court and you're the judge. The witnesses come forward and they give their version of what they've seen. And you, as the historian, have to be the judge guessing at the veracity of these witnesses. Mm-hmm. In a court, one man comes and says, I saw this man do a murder. The next man says, no, I saw somebody else do the murder. As the judge, it's your job to guess which is the two is more verifiable, which one sounds as if he's telling the truth. And the historian has to make the same judgments. You may make the wrong judgment. So there's two different accounts about Melinda and Nagasena, and you have to judge basically on which is the original source. And my understanding is that the Buddhists basically exaggerate and claim Melinda as a Buddhist, because you can see the story growing in the telling as different versions come over different periods of time. So just as with the modern trial, you would privilege the account of an eyewitness over someone that's telling hearsay or has been told by their grandmother or their cousin or their sister about a story. So as a historian, you privilege eyewitness accounts over those which are hundreds of years later.
And how do we differentiate when there are two claims on one thing, like that statue of Shiva in the Metropolitan Museum? So it can be visualized as Oesho,
yeah,
that Iranian god? So
even today,
there's a debate.
Even today, people will call gods by different names.
Mm-hmm.
Some may call it the name of a local folk deity, some may call it Lord Shiva. Mm-hmm. The same, I think, is true in antiquity, that you have the same god called by different names depending on who's looking at it. Mm. And so we have a very, as you say, we have this early image now in the Met Museum of a god which could be Osho or it could be Shiva. And it's got a third eye, and it's got what looks like Nandi, but the inscription says Osho. Who at that stage, Osho is the Iranian wind god. So again, a lot
or
of
maybe
this
the
is,
same god but different names.
Or maybe an Iranian saw him as Osho and an Indian would see him as Shiva. That's what probably seems to be likely.
Okay. So we are largely, for the ancient Indian history and ancient Indian influence, we are relying primarily on coins.
Correct.
And
epigraphy on inscriptions.
And stone. I mean, that can be the Ashoka pillar, or that can be all the Kushana Kushan time Buddha statues with various impressions of various culture. This was possible primarily because of Asang and his interpretation of Buddhism, the Mahayana Buddhism. Please tell us about him.
So, any religion develops. The first version of Christianity given by Jesus is probably quite different to the high Christianity of the Middle Ages with cathedrals and bishops and popes. The same is true of Hinduism, the same is true of Buddhism. And what you get in the very early Buddhist Sangha is a very austere form of the religion, when all the faithful are really offered is nirvana, escape. There's no promise of paradise, there's no promise of the Buddha coming to help you when you need him. It's a very pure and quite harsh philosophy. And some scholars believe that it's the competition with Hinduism that makes Buddhism change. With Hinduism, you can go into a temple, a Puranic temple, and you can have darshan of a god. You can see a god, you can say your prayers to the god, and you can believe that the god is answering your prayers.
You feel more fulfilled.
You feel more fulfilled. With Buddhism, with pure early Buddhism, the Buddha's enlightened, so he's gone. Gone, as actually one of the early Buddhist scriptures says. And he's not there. He is a flame blown out by the wind. So you can pray all you like, but there's no one to listen. So what happens is that 200 or 300 years later, you get a different form of Buddhism, the Mahayana school of Buddhism. And that has the Bodhisattvas. And the Bodhisattvas are divine beings who could have been enlightened, but have decided to stay behind in our world to help believers. So there is somebody you can pray for. So if you want a girlfriend or a wife, or you haven't managed to have children, or you need to pass an exam, or you need to conquer your neighbor, you can go and ask the Bodhisattva, and you can pray to him, and he can help you. So Avalokiteshvara, Maitreya, all these bodhisattvas come in.
Manjushri and all.
Exactly. And so Buddhism becomes more complex and in a sense becomes more like Hindu.
Is it a Quranic influence?
Many scholars would believe so, yes, although I'm sure Buddhists would probably resist that interpretation.
Interesting, because when we read for the chapters and the route taken by Asanga and or the Lotus Sutra thing and everything, it has great influence on that expansion part.
And Nalanda, the greatest of all the Buddhist monasteries and in a sense the Harvard or the Oxford of ancient India, becomes particularly famous for its Mahayana scholars, and particularly the school of Asanga, which is the Yogacara texts.
Translation also played a crucial role. We have talked about Xuanzang. Kumar Jiva, the first person who actually translated. Tell us about it, because in today's time we don't pay much attention to this, that how important it can be. Translation, I mean, when we'll go to the second last chapter, that Brahmin from Ujjain and that book of Brahmagupta, and again the role of translation is there.
So Kumar Jiva has an ethnic Indian father and a Chinese Kutcha from Western China mother. And because of this, like today, if you have a mixed parentage, often you have both languages. So he becomes one of the first scholars who translates Prakrit and Sanskrit into classical Chinese. And his versions of the scriptures were very beautifully written. They had a great lilting beauty to them. But Xuanzang, who comes later, thinks they're not accurate translations, that they're too poetic, they're too liberal in their translation. So you get, like today, people like different versions of the Mahabharata or whatever. So you get that. And as you pointed out, later on, there's a very important moment when Indian mathematical texts are having to be translated into Arabic. So 200 years after the period we've been talking about, the Arab kingdoms, Islam arrives, it gets as far as the Indus. It doesn't come initially into India proper, but it stops at the Indus. And the kings of the sultans of Baghdad, the Abbasid sultans and the caliphs, want to get their hands on the brilliant masterworks of Indian science, particularly the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And the people that are encouraging them are an extraordinary family who I think are not famous in India, but should be, because they do more to bring Indian science to the rest of the world than anyone else. And this is a family called the Barmakids.
Yes.
Now the Barmak is the Arab version of a Sanskrit word, which is Pramukh.
Yes.
So Pramukh becomes Barmak. And these are a family of hereditary Buddhist abbots who've grown up reading Prakrit and reading Sanskrit, are part of, culturally at least, of the Indian world, although they're based...
And they were in the Balkh region or the Takshila region?
They were in the Balkh region of Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan. And they were in charge of a monastery called Naubahar, which was like the Nalanda of Central Asia. Big library.
Is it like Navvihar?
Navvihar, exactly. And so these guys fall within the area of early Arab conquest. And they make the decision to convert to Islam. And they are rewarded for this pragmatic move by being kept on by the Arabs as the governors of this region. And the very first mosque in Central Asia is built within the walls of Naubahar in Balkh. And it's still there. It's a famous, archaeologists often show photographs of this mosque in Balkh.
At the same time, they were being ridiculed as well, because the opponents were like, the sheer mention of anything Indian, including Indian gods, brings a smile on their face.
So these guys are obviously playing a double game. They're being very Muslim when they're with the Arabs, but when they're with their Indian friends, they get excited about Hindu gods and Buddhist gods. Anyway, because of their skills in mathematics and administration, this family become the viziers in Baghdad. And bizarrely, there is a Disney version of this. Anyone that's ever seen the cartoon Aladdin?
Yeah.
If you remember, there's that character who looks very Indian there, Jafar.
Jafar.
He has a parrot on his
Yeah.
shoulder. And he's in the Disney version, he's the demon, he's the villain. He's a real man. And he is the fourth generation of the Barmakid viziers of Baghdad. And we know about him because he appears as one of the heroes of the Arabian Nights, one of the great works of Arab literature of the period. And Jafar Barmak is the best friend of Harun al-Rashid, who is the king, the Sultan of Baghdad.
Very famous Sultan.
And this family send over the Indus to Sindh for the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta. And these are brought in one volume called The Great Sindh Hind, is what the Arabs call it. It's brought by, and we know the details because there's accounts of the embassy arriving. They also brought the works of Charaka, early Ayurvedic texts. So these mathematical and medical texts arrive in Baghdad, and they are complex texts. They're not easy to translate at all. And so what we get is, it's 2 generations before a good translation is made. And a man comes from Khwarazm, which is modern Uzbekistan, near the Aral Sea.
Khorasan, yeah.
Khwarazm, not Khorasan, Khwarazm, which is a similar sort of name.
Yeah.
And he's known, because he's from Khwarazm, as Al-Khwarizmi, the man from Khwarazm. And he comes to Baghdad, translates Aryabhatta, translates Brahmagupta, and produces a book which he gives a long-winded title to, called The Compendious Book of Calculation and Balancing by Hindu Calculation. And because it's got such a long name, everyone just knows it by its nickname as Algebra, which is where we
comes
get our
algebra.
word algebra. And that's how algebra leaves India and enters the Arab world. And the name Al-Khwarizmi eventually arrives in the West, and it's converted into the word algorithm. So when you read about Elon Musk and the algorithms of Facebook or Twitter or all this stuff today, this goes back to this period, and it's Indian ideas being translated into Arabic. And that's this moment, this new learning arrives in the Islamic world. And Khwarizmi has the capacity to create really clear, simple Arabic prose. Aryabhatta was a genius, but he wraps up his mathematical theories in
poetry.
verse, in poetry. And you need another volume to understand it because it's so complicated. It's very dense, it's very short. And every line means, a million things. So Al-Khwarizmi unwraps it and translates it very clearly and simply into Arabic. So his version spreads throughout the Arab world. And eventually, at this point, Europeans, as late as the 12th century, are still using Latin numbers. X, M, V, C. Try doing long multiplication with MCVXM times CCMVX. It's very difficult. And then in the 12th century, the kingdom of Pisa, which is where the Leaning Tower is, it's this independent port town in Tuscany. They send a notary to Algeria to open a trading station, because Italy and North Africa are in trade relations at this period. And the man brings his son. And like my kids went to school here in Delhi and learnt Hindi, so this young kid goes to school in Algeria and learns Arabic, but he also learns Al-Khwarizmi's method of mathematics, which is the Indian method.
Which is the Brahmagupta method.
The Brahmagupta method, now in an Arabic form. And luckily for us, that kid is Fibonacci.
Yes.
And Fibonacci takes it back to Italy, where he writes a book called the Liber Abaci, the Book of Numbers. So it's like a...
And then he was asked to write a easier version of it as well.
More
by
practical,
the king.
by the king. So the king asked, so it's all too theoretical. We want an easier version, more practical, with money lending, with double accounting, with weights and measures, with all the things you need when you're actually a merchant or in trade. So Fibonacci agrees and writes a second version, which is practical. And this is what changes Europe to the Indian method of numbers. It's what produces
1
the
to 9
rise.
and 0 and all the uses of 0.
Exactly. And this is what produces the Renaissance. There is a painter called Piero della Francesca, who's a famous Italian painter. He's also a mathematician, and he writes 3 mathematical treatises based on Fibonacci. And his friend, Fra Luca Caroli, takes it to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, and that flatmate is Leonardo da Vinci.
There comes Renaissance.
So it's like a relay race. So you start off with Aryabhatta in Pataliputra in Bihar, then to Brahmagupta in Mount Abu,
Mount Abu
in Rajasthan. From Mount Abu, it moves to Baghdad with Al-Khwarizmi. From Al-Khwarizmi, it goes to Algeria, and Fibonacci takes it to Italy, and finally arrives in Leonardo da Vinci in Milan. So these ideas are passed from intellectual to intellectual, scholar to scholar, but they originate here in India. And no one in the West knows this. When you talk about these
Even
numbers,
in India,
they think this Arabic
how
numbers.
many people know Brahmagupta and his pioneering work.
So anyway, this is what I've tried to pull together. I mean, as I say, there's stuff here which many Indian scholars have written about. What I've tried to do, though, is bring it all within one cover so that with one book you can really understand how these ideas move around the world.
And you not only bring all those facts together, but you give us a solid narrative as well. How to look at the contradictions of this history rather than looking for one linear narrative.
History is full of contradictions and nuance. It's not a story of villains and heroes. Everyone in real life, like it, I'm sure, in this office, in anywhere today, shades of grey.
Yeah.
You know, it's complicated. And yet this book, I think, tells a story of what I call the Indosphere, this area of Indian influence, and the trade routes, which I call the Golden Road, which brought Indian ideas not just to the West, but also, we haven't talked about this so much, how Sanskrit and Hinduism and Hindu scriptures and Hindu ideas of kingship spread to Southeast Asia. All these ideas are important.
I have reached to 6th chapter and it's going to talk about it. So now let's talk about Mahendravarman Pallav and the Pallav dynasty and the spread of Hinduism and Sanskrit. But before we talk about all those countries and the influence, I'm really intrigued with Mahendravarman's scholarly work, literary work, especially those two really crazy drama he has written.
So today, although your Prime Minister does podcasts and does radio shows, he hasn't, as far as I know, produced any plays for performance.
Not so far.
But Mahendra Pallava, who in the 7th century was this extraordinary ruler of the area around Kanchipuram, south of Chennai, Mamallapuram was part of his area. And he is this rock star. He writes poetry, he writes on aesthetics, he writes on music. One of the earliest South Indian texts on Carnatic music is written by this guy. But the things for which he's most famous are these 2 short plays, which are absurd and humorous plays, rather like the works of Beckett or one of these very modern playwrights working in the world today. And Mahendra Pallava produces one story about a bar where a courtesan, a prostitute, is at the bar and with a Buddhist monk, and the Buddhist monk has got a skull which he's drinking spirits out of, and the skull goes missing, and it's all a big mix-up. Then there's another one when Yama, the god of death, mixes up a scholar with a prostitute. So you have the prostitute speaking like a scholar and the
scholar talking like a prostitute.
So these are kind of light, funny
And the best
plays.
part is nobody was offended back at that time.
In those days, I think you couldn't do this today, probably, get away with it. But he was the king, so he was able to.
So we were talking about the expansion of Buddhism and the trade route and everything during Ashoka and then Kanishka and then even during Harsha's time. The spread of Hinduism, especially towards east. I mean, we have Angkor Wat, we have so many temples, so many names, inscription of Ramayana and Mahabharata and everything. What started this cultural dominance?
So what happens is that initially Indian trade is focused with Rome. And gold is just pouring into India. India's a bit like modern Saudi Arabia, where these guys don't have to get out of bed anymore. The oil keeps pumping, and these guys become very rich. Ancient India was a bit like that. You had the pepper, you had the tusks of the elephants, the ivory. You had all these
and the understanding of monsoon winds.
And understanding of monsoon winds. So you didn't even have to kind of paddle. You just went on the winds. And India becomes very rich. But in the 5th century, Rome falls. And not only does Rome disappear, but even the harbours that all these ships have been leaving from are abandoned. It's a catastrophe. It's like the apocalypse. And this affects India because the gold which has been pouring in stops. Like that. No more. So what seems to happen is that India pivots. And where it's been looking westwards from the west coast ports like Muziris in Kerala, from Gujarat, from Sindh, the action moves to the east coast. So you get Nagapattinam, which is south of Chennai, near Chidambaram. You get Mahabalipuram, which is again south of Chennai. Further up, you've got the ports of Orissa, and then finally Tamralipti, which is like the ancient Calcutta.
Port, yeah.
And these guys pioneer trade with the area that comes to be known as Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. And in the Jataka tales and in the Ramayana, you have all these stories of
Sugriva also talks about it.
Talks to Hanuman saying, you go to Savarna Dvipa, you kick the land and gold appears. It's like magic. And so there were gold mines there. And although India has gold, it wasn't known about in antiquity. The Kola gold fields, which were the main Indian source of gold, had not been discovered. So Indians had to trade to get the gold in, and when Rome stopped, they had to go to Sarawak and to areas of Thailand and Malaysia where there are gold mines. And from the 5th century, exactly the time that Rome is falling, we suddenly start finding Tamil touchstones of goldsmiths and inscriptions about the Tamil trading guilds, this extraordinary group called the 500,
yes,
who are a bit like the East India Company, but they last 1,000 years. They're incredible. And they're quite badass. They have assassins, they have soldiers. If you mess with the 500, you soon live to regret it. And these guys pioneer routes eastwards. And soon you get, as always, following the traders, you get the intellectuals, you get the Brahmins. And Southeast Asia was only just beginning to urbanize. You get the first trading settlements at the mouths of the estuaries of the rivers, like the Mekong,
yes,
and other places. People are bringing forest products down to the edge of to the rivers, on the edge of the ports.
Ready to sell to the traders.
Ready to sell to the traders. And this escalates suddenly in the 5th century. When there's no more Rome to trade with, all the attention is on this area. And once gold is discovered, it becomes a big deal. So you get the 500, this Tamil trading guilds, really moving in. And at the same time, the local rulers, there is no alphabet, no literacy in ancient Southeast Asia. So the Brahmins turn up from Kanchipuram, from Mahabalipuram, and they offer the local script, which
providing them legacy and a cultural belonging.
But also, more practically, the Pallava Grantha script. Now, the Pallava Grantha is the round script, which
yes,
is the basis for both modern Tamil and Malayalam, but also for every script in Southeast Asia. So Pew, Thai, Mon, not Japanese, but the Southeast Asian scripts, okay, Mon, Thai, Khmer. So you find the same rounded scripts that you see in South India adapted from the Pallava Grantha scripts. Southern Brahmi in its form developed in Kanchipuram. And with this, the courts slowly start converting to Hinduism. So there's an inscription by a guy whose grandfather is called Kudunga, but he's called Mulavarman. He has a Sanskrit name. And
then all those stories that Brahmin goes and marries a serpent king's daughter. And
all
then,
this sort of stuff, yeah. So Indians are now
descendant of
moving...
Ashwatthama and all those stories.
Large numbers of Indians, despite the laws of Manu, large numbers of Indians of all different castes are going across. And with the changes of the names of the kings, you also have the names of Indian cities reappearing.
Like Ayodhya.
There's an Ayodhya outside Bangkok. There's a Kurukshetra out in Laos. There is an Amaravati in Vietnam. And most important of all, down the middle of it is the river, which we know as Mekong, but this is just a version of, in Khmer, of Ma Gang. Mekong, Ma Gang. It's the same word. So one of the ways I think that the Brahmins justify their presence in Southeast Asia, crossing the backwater, is that they just moved the Ganga. The Ganga is meant to be the eastern boundary of India. Now it's at the Mekong. So you have...
And then those stories that few of them flew.
By means of yoga, they say. Yeah. So one way or another, they find a way around this. And you find the landscape turning into a new bit of India. With Sanskrit names, familiar names from the Puranas, from the Mahabharata, from the Ramayana. And the surprise is that the largest Hindu temple in the world is built not in India, but in Cambodia. And I have to say, and I don't think the government will like me saying this, but the largest Hindu empire in the world is probably the Khmer Empire.
12th century.
12th century. And that spreads right through Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. And arguably is the largest Hindu empire ever, but I don't want to lose my visa by saying this out loud. But I think you can make that case. And Angkor Wat is I think it's 1.2 million people in Greater Angkor at a time when London is about 20,000 people. Wow. So it's an enormous metropolis. So what happens by the 12th century is that the largest Hindu kingdoms and the most powerful Hindu states and the largest Hindu temples are all in Southeast Asia. So it's very strange that we've forgotten all this. And occasionally, I think Indians, when they go to Southeast Asia, are very surprised when they see Hinduism, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, all over an area so far from India. But it's slightly different from the Indian form. So when Tagore goes to Angkor Wat, he says, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her. And that's very important. It's a slightly different form. So, for example, the ashes of King Suryavarman, who built it, are in the central tower. Now, you don't get that in Tanjore or Madurai or any of the great temples, or Tirupati. You don't get
That's the place where you hitchhiked on a scooter?
That was at a place called Nomda. And that was going out to one of the early Khmer capitals. Anyway, so Hinduism evolves and continues to evolve when it goes to Southeast Asia. But the important point is that I think that you get massive Indian influence over this whole area in language, in literature. And the Khmers become very nerdy in their perfection of their Sanskrit. So there's no errors in the Sanskrit inscriptions you find in Cambodia.
You almost complained about it, that they are so bookish in their nature.
They're very bookish. And you find that some of the prime ministers of the Khmer kings are showing off their intellectual knowledge of everything Hindu. So obviously they've got the kind of famous scenes from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. You have the churning of the ocean. You have Ravan shaking Mount Kailash to try and get the attention of Lord Shiva. You have all those sort of famous stories. But you also have obscure stories that, so for example, there's a particular story of a Tamil Amma, a goddess, which isn't even known in Andhra Pradesh or Kerala.
But she's revered there.
But she's referred to in Cambodia. So these guys are, really laying on the fact that they are big intellectuals in Sanskrit. And part of the Sanskrit world that then spreads all the way from Kandahar to Java. So it's really, really important and interesting, but it's not a Hindu colony as earlier generations of scholar thought. People like R.C. Majumdar in the 1930s were writing about Hindu colonies. That's not right. They weren't colonies. They were never ruled from Kanchipuram or from Tanjore. What they were, it's not an empire of the sword, it's an empire of the spirit. And that, in a way, is much more unusual. History is full of empires, people marching in with armies, putting other people down, imposing their ideas by force. What's far rarer is the spread of ideas peacefully.
So they adopted ideas.
They chose, so the kings choose Sanskrit, they choose the Mahabharata, they choose the Ramayana. It's not that someone's saying you've got to be a good Hindu or you've got to be a good Buddhist. They choose it for their own reasons. They adapt it slightly to their purposes. For example,
there was no conversion by force.
No conversion by force. And they adapt it. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, all the Hindus continue to eat pork. Mm-hmm. There's no caste in the way that you get it in India. There's some elements of caste, but there's not. It's not.
I marked that part where you highlighted it. That thankfully, in the Southeast Asia, they did not adopt the caste system. They did not adopt the food system. So there are scriptures on the temple wall.
Yep.
That they are cooking pork and
they have women as the temple Brahmins.
Yes.
Never happens here, but it does happen in Southeast Asia.
And almost a hereditary system where one passes to the other.
Yeah. So it adapts, but it changes. Anyway, all this and more is in this book. It's I think you'll find people that even those who know their history very well will find things to surprise them in here.
Last question is about that the heroic raid of Rajendra Chola, that how the king tricks Chinese that, oh, he's one of my subordinate, and when he discovers that, Cholas discover that this is how they are being projected, they get furious, and there comes the great raid. So
I said that there's no Hindu colonies in Southeast Asia, but in the 11th century, 1016 and again in 1025, what you do get is Chola raids. And they burn various parts of Malaysia, they burn the area around Singapore, the Malacca Straits, and there is some suggestion there might even have been a Chola viceroy for a generation or something in that area. But the Cholas and the Khmers are allies, and they have diplomatic relations, they're sending presents in both directions. And you have a lot of ideas moving from the Cholas to the Khmers. So for example, in Tanjore, they build a dance hall on the edge of their temple. 20 years later, you find the same thing happening in Angkor Wat. So these guys are in regular contact and passing on their ideas from one to the other.
हम अब किताब पे ज़्यादा बात इसलिए नहीं कर रहे हैं ताकि आपकी दिलचस्पी पढ़ने में बनी रहे. इसमें एक कंकबाइन, ये एक राजसी वैश्या की कहानी है जो 5वें दर्जे की कंकबाइन थी और किस तरह से उसको जिम्मेदारी मिलती है राजा की राजसी पोशाकों को संभालने की. फिर वो राजा मर जाता है तो नियम के तहत जितनी भी ऐसी वैश्याएं हैं राजसी जिनके बच्चे नहीं हैं उनको नन बन जाना पड़ता है, उनको भिक्षु बन जाना पड़ता है. पर फिर राजा का बेटा आता है, वो उसको एक प्रणय से भरी कविता लिख के देती हैं, वापस ले जाता है और किस तरह से वो अपने साम्राज्य का विस्तार करती है. जो मुख्य रानी है उसको किस तरह से हटाती है, मृत्युदंड दिलवाती है बुरी तरह से, मुख्य जो राजसी वेश्या है उसको. इस तरह की कहानियाँ हैं. हेनसांग जिनको हम कहते हैं, जिनका सही नाम शुएनजोंग है, उनकी कहानी है कि राज्य आदेश के बावजूद वो इस यात्रा पर निकले क्योंकि वो जो बुद्धिस्ट टेक्स्ट पढ़ रहे थे उन्हें शक था कि ये दुरुस्त नहीं और मैं नालंदा जाके 3000 मील दूर जाके सही टेक्स्ट पता करूँगा. पैदल वो इस यात्रा पर निकलते हैं जिसमें कई दिनों की मरुस्थल की यात्रा है, जहाँ पर रास्ता बताने का ज़रिया क्या है, लोगों के शवों के अवशेष यानी कि उनकी हड्डियाँ और जो जानवर गुजरे हैं यदि उनका मल वहाँ रास्ते मिल जाए. वो इकलौता तरीका है जानने का. और ऐसे ही वो रास्ते पे होते हैं तो उन्हें सनसनाते हुए तीरों का सामना करना पड़ता है. पर उनकी किस्मत है कि जो उस वॉच टावर में वॉचमैन था वो बुद्धिस्ट था और वो इनके मकसद को जानता है तो इनको जाने देता है. और जब ये वापसी भी कर रहे होते हैं तो किस तरह से नदी में इनकी तमाम मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट्स बह जाती हैं. इस तरह की तमाम दिलचस्प कहानियाँ हैं जो द गोल्डन रोड में. यदि आपकी भारत के प्राचीन इतिहास में, भारत की मेधा में, भारत के खूबसूरत सांस्कृतिक सम्मिश्रण में भारत की साइंस में दिलचस्पी है तो आपको ये किताब ज़रूर पढ़नी चाहिए. William, I have few other questions as well.
I'm going to have to run quite quickly.
The historians, few of them, they have very strong objection on your style of history writing.
I'm not sure that's true. My books have won all the big history prizes. And,
we all are great fan of your writing, and we believe that this is how it should be written. But few of them are not particularly very happy with you.
I think there are many
All
ways.
the Lallantop and Irfan Habibs of this world.
Irfan Habib objected to a book I wrote 20 years ago before he'd read it called The Last Mughal, based on a report in a newspaper. But he invited me then to speak at Aligarh. Lallantop I see regularly. We have no quarrel. No, I've never received a negative review from either.
Mm-hmm. But you really think that Indian historians was that the report was untrue, where you said that they are kind of lazy creatures, not reading newspapers properly?
I remember waking. I was in Delhi at the time, and in those days newspapers were delivered under the door, and I remember seeing on the bottom of the Times of India, Dalrymple says Indian historians are lazy. And as soon as I saw that, I knew there's going to be some terrific. I've never ever said anything like that, ever. What I did say in the context of this was that no Indian historian had used the 1857 mutiny papers in the National Archives. Or no one working in English. There were a few Urdu historians who'd done so. Anyway, this got turned by the newspaper into Dalrymple says Indian historians are lazy, and of course there was a kerfuffle. But
we were going through one of your interview in Indian Express where you said that this is very unfortunate that whosoever is writing on medieval India, especially Mughals, they are termed Marxist, and whosoever is writing on ancient India, they are termed rightist.
Yes, there is. It's a unique thing in India that there's this perception that if you write about the Mughals, you are glorifying the Mughals, and somehow you're a Marxist associated with the Congress Party, Aligarh. While if you're interested in ancient India, you are a RSS Prachatnik with khaki shorts and busy making RSS rallies and so on. Obviously, this is nonsense. You can be interested in a period of history. You don't have to be from one political persuasion or another. I myself am a centrist. I'm not a Marxist or a rightist. And I'm interested in both periods of history. So I don't understand this division. But there is a perception that somehow that anyone that writes about the Mughals is glorifying the Mughals, and anyone that writes about ancient India is somehow
glorifying the great Hindus.
Glorifying the great Hindus. I don't think that's, obviously, I don't agree with that, so no.
In the book, you have given so many examples of the things which were discovered outside India, in the current political map I am talking about. Do you think that India badly needs a cultural renaissance, a history renaissance, where we start preserving the monuments we have? We do the right kind of digging, where we explore more about and we rely more on the scientific instruments like carbon dating and other stuff, and not giving the preconceived judgments or the analysis, but we approach with all the curiosity what is there in our history.
This is very important. India is no longer a poor country. India has rejigged every airport in the country. You go to a small provincial town in Andhra Pradesh now and you'll find an amazing state-of-the-art airport with Digiyatra gates doing facial recognition and all the latest gizmos. But if you go to the museums of India, even the National Museum in Delhi is ramshackle.
Yes.
With dusty display cases, with strip lights, with disgraceful actually. And the truth is that India does not respect history, does not invest in museums, does not give enough money to the Archaeological Survey of India to preserve and look after its monuments. Even more than that, it doesn't have a proper system of architectural grading and listing, so that if you are the private owner of a beautiful Haveli, you can knock it down tomorrow and build a car park. Now, that's not the case in Italy or in Britain. If I own a nice 17th century house, There are strict rules about what I can alter. If it's grade 1, I can alter almost nothing. If it's grade 2, I can alter the interior but not the exterior. And you get into terrific penalties and can go to prison if you start messing with important heritage, even if you own it. And this means that ultimately you get beautiful cities full of well-preserved historic monuments which attract tourists. Now, India is got a history and a heritage second to none anywhere in the world. There should be hundreds of millions of tourists coming to India every year. The reality is that India gets less tourists than Singapore or Dubai, which is outrageous. And the reason, partly for that, there's lots of reasons for it, but I think one of the main reasons is we don't respect our heritage. You go to Agra, there's been 4 major monuments destroyed this year alone, major monuments that have just been allowed to crumble or knocked down by builders in collusion with the authorities. And if you do that, you won't get tourists. If you just let your heritage be destroyed, no one's going to come and see it. So I think
a historian has to rely on the on the sympathy of a priest, whether he'll open the Adivara temple or not.
Exactly that. And so I think the comparison I would draw is with Turkey. Turkey is a much poorer country than India. But I went round the east of Turkey this summer. The government has built amazing state-of-the-art museums in even quite small provincial towns. 4 or 5 different towns I went to where there's, in the last 10 years, absolutely first-rate museums with brilliant displays, with good lighting, with air conditioning, with all the things you'd expect to see in the Louvre or the Met Museum in New York or anything else. There's nowhere in India that has that at the moment because the ASI is not given the funding and history is not given the importance. And I think India is suffering. It's suffering because you're losing your own history. And you're suffering because you're not getting tourists, which is, a country like Italy or France gets about a quarter of its income from tourism.
Yes.
India has a tiny fraction. And there it's limited, here it's limited only to Rajasthan, Goa, and a few areas. Most of India sees no tourists at all from abroad. Go to Andhra Pradesh,
we did not preserve our history.
Yeah. So, and also it means that India's version of history, India's account of its own history is not known well even in India. Because you're not investing in your history, because the history is being destroyed, people are not knowledgeable about history. WhatsApp forwards get treated as the authentic story when it's not. It's just some old uncle tapping away on his WhatsApp. And Nalanda is a good example. Nalanda was the greatest university in Asia. Now that should be a place that is beautifully looked after, excavated with the greatest care. Only 10% of the site has been looked at so far. 90% remains unexcavated. The museum looks like it was built 150 years ago with no good lighting. Half the lighting is off. And the roads to get there in Bihar are terrible. Now,
the first case, even if we only properly focus on the Buddhist sites.
Well, I mean, focus on all the different sites. You have such a diverse.
Just to begin with, yeah.
But Nalanda is somewhere that anywhere else in the world there'd be massive investment in it, and you'd have tens of thousands of tourists every day, spending their money, buying hotel rooms, using local restaurants, going on Indian airlines. It's a very profitable circle. You invest and you get returns. But at the moment, what's happening is the history is being destroyed. No resources have been given to its study, to its excavation, and it'll disappear. Future generations will look back on this generation and curse you for not having looked after what was yours. This is the heritage of this country. Nowhere in Asia has as much as you guys have. Everywhere you go, there's beautiful, beautiful buildings, extraordinary rich history from every period of history. But perhaps because of that richness, you take it for granted and you don't look after it.
One of the remarks which caught my attention, I was going through your interviews, was that most of the Indian historians, they do not pay enough attention to personalities. And this is something we found in your writing, that you don't only tell us about the dates or about the few traits, you focus on the person and then we feel more associated.
Well, I should say that there are many different ways to be a historian. If you want to be an academic historian studying the economy, that is absolutely fine. I'm not telling anyone that that's the wrong way of doing something. Scholarship justifies itself. Good scholarship is good scholarship. That's enough. But if you want people to take an interest in history, you want people to read history and be attracted to history, I believe personally that history can be made more interesting by a more biographical approach. Now I'm not laying down the law saying other people have to do this, but I certainly find that if you tell history within a narrative, with biography, with personality, it certainly makes it more palatable. And it's just the way that I write, but I think that it can be very much more accessible to people without in any way undermining the scholarliness, the authenticity of the sources, the seriousness of the historical work, judging falsehood from truth, from accuracy, from hearsay. And it's not a criticism, it's just it's something I've noticed that a lot of Indian history, certainly up to about 10 or 20 years ago, there was very few biographies. That's changing now. You see lots of very brilliant Indian historians like Manu Pillai, Ruby Lal, Anirudh Kanasetti. There are so many now, and it is changing. It's not like it was, but I think it's something that for many years, many people found their history classes very dense and very off-putting. And one of the things I get, certainly writing the way I do, is I get emails and letters from readers saying, I hated history at school, but. And history doesn't have to be boring. History is full of extraordinary stories.
This is all the knowledge related stuff. I was very surprised to read about St. Thomas, and because most of the Indians, they think that, Christianity, when East India Company came, or in the medieval time, when there was Sir Thomas Roe and few other fellows, that's how Christianity arrived in India. But when we read about Thomas, it's almost at the beginning of the Christian time.
So there's two different things here. There's the historical fact that we know that Christianity arrived in India very early on, the same time as these Romans were coming, trading in silks, trading in ivories, trading in pepper. Not just Christianity, but Judaism, Christianity, and very early on, by the 6th or 7th century, in South India, you've got also Islam, in Kerala and in Tamil Nadu, at both Calicut and Kodangalore in Kerala, and at Sri Rangam in Tamil Nadu, very early mosques. So all these three Abrahamic religions are coming in very early. The story of St. Thomas himself, we have no verified source saying he definitely came. There's a 3rd century book written in Turkey, in what's now eastern Turkey, Edessa, called The Acts of Thomas, that tells a legend that he came. We don't know. That's certainly it's certainly the conviction of the Christian faithful that St. Thomas started their church. Evidence may come. At the moment, it's not there. But what we do know for sure is that Christianity was there early on. We have an authentic 2nd and 3rd century source in Alexandria talking about Indian Christians coming to Alexandria, asking for bishops and asking for texts and asking for relics and paraphernalia of the church. So we know there were Christians there from early on. We don't know for a fact who converted them. The Indian Christians believe they were converted by St. Thomas, but that at the moment remains a story and an article of faith rather than a historical fact.
I love the expression at the moment, because one fine day there might people who go out for fishing, and then they will be divers, and then they will
just
see.
3 years ago, we found this Buddha on the Red Sea coast of Egypt. That was not there 3 years ago. Now it is. We know that Buddhism was there. It's more than likely that some
and the discovery of that ship close to Singapore.
Yes, exactly. So archaeology is very active all over the world, and we will learn a lot more in years to come, particularly if India invests more in the ASI. I think the ASI is the most underfunded government organization, and if I had a magic wand, the first thing I'd do, I think, would be to double the funds with the ASI so they can build some decent museums, so they can look after. I live next to Zafar Mahal in Mehrauli. Every year another jali is smashed, or some kids destroy a important sculpture because they haven't got the security staff to look after it properly, and no one cares. And that's just the site I happen to live next to. It's the same all over the country. Things are disappearing. Whole sites are going. Kos minars of the Mughals marking the road signs and so on. And that's not okay. These things are very important to preserve.
And even if we look at it purely from the revenue point of view, if we invest 100 rupees, it will give us back 10,000 rupees. I mean, purely simple mathematics, which we are great at. The people who coined numbers 1 to 9 and 0. So we better pay attention. Your podcast is very popular, The Empire. Is there a probability that there will be a podcast on the Golden Road as well? I mean,
there has been. No, we've done it on Empire. So please tune in. My podcast is called Empire. You can see it on YouTube, or you can download it on
the
Apple or Spotify. And at the moment, it is being downloaded 880,000 times a week, which is extraordinary. There's a real appetite for this kind of thing. India, I think, podcasts are still a growing market. It's early days here. But I'm at the moment neck and neck with Sadhguru on the chart. So sometimes he beats me, sometimes I beat him.
What next after the Golden Road?
I'm not sure. I was planning to write about the Opium Wars, this terrible story of the East India Company becoming like Pablo Escobar. Mm-hmm. But I've so enjoyed writing early Indian history. I might find some other subject to do with the early period. So we'll see.
Oh, that will be wonderful. किताबवाला में आज के लिए इतना ही. द गोल्डन रोड पर हम विस्तार से बात कर रहे थे. दिलचस्प किताब है. यदि आपकी हिंदुस्तान में दिलचस्पी है तो ज़रूर पढ़नी चाहिए. और जो बात विलियम ने बार बार कही कि अगर हिंदुस्तान केयर करना शुरू नहीं करेगा अपनी हिस्ट्री की, प्रिजर्व करना शुरू नहीं करेगा, तो सबसे ज़्यादा नुकसान है आपका. इस दृष्टि से भी कि आप अपनी धरोहर खो रहे हैं, और इस दृष्टि से भी कि आप दुनिया भर के टूरिस्ट को अट्रैक्ट करने की और उसके ज़रिए अपना राजस्व बेहतर करने की, रोज़गार के अवसर बेहतर करने की संभावना भी खो रहे हैं. हम उम्मीद करते हैं कि देश के नागरिक और उन नागरिकों के बिना पर शासन कर रही देश की सरकार और राज्यों की सरकारें इस पर ध्यान देंगी. किताबवाला में ज़रूरी किताबों पर बात यूं ही चलती रहेगी. कमेंट बॉक्स में बताइए आप कौन सी किताब पढ़ रहे हैं इन दिनों. आज के लिए इतना ही. शुक्रिया.